Companies are using artificial intelligence to do something most employees still don't know is happening. Not just to replace tasks, to measure, compare, and rank the people who work for them. And that information is already shaping who gets promoted, who gets stuck, and who gets let go, often before the people affected even realize the process has begun. It sounds like science fiction, but it isn't. Over the past few years, a category of tools has quietly become a standard part of HR departments at mid-sized and large companies. It's called People Analytics, and its job is to analyze employees' digital behavior, to build profiles, make comparisons, and generate predictions. How quickly you respond to emails, how often you participate in recorded meetings, how much you interact with other teams across corporate platforms, how you use project management software. Taken together, all of that data creates a profile of each employee that in some cases is more detailed than any performance review a manager could put together by hand. And that profile exists, whether anyone has ever told you about it or not. But here's what most people never stop to think about. What these tools measure isn't always what companies say they value. In meetings and internal presentations, organizations talk about culture, collaboration, and meaningful impact. The systems used to rank employees measure something very different. They measure response times, visible interactions across platforms that can be tracked, and activity in channels where everything is logged. They don't measure the 10-minute conversation that solved a critical problem. They don't measure the years of accumulated experience someone draws on to prevent mistakes before they ever happen. They don't measure the trust built with a client who renews a contract because someone inside the company took the time to truly understand them. It looks like the system is measuring performance. What it's really measuring is visibility. Imagine two people on the same team. The first has spent 10 years at the company. She knows the shortcuts no one ever documented. She remembers which projects failed in the past, and exactly why. Over the years, she's built relationships across the organization that quietly produce results long before problems ever show up on a dashboard. Whenever something goes wrong, she's the person everyone calls, even though those contributions never get captured by any system. The second employee has been with the company for 3 years. He answers emails within minutes. He's active in every internal communication channel. Every project is documented in the right system. His progress is updated consistently, and he generates a steady stream of measurable interactions with people across different teams. In a human evaluation with the full context, the first employee's contributions would probably be recognized as deeper, more valuable, and far harder to replace. But in a system built around digital behavioral data, the second employee generates a much clearer, more consistent, and ultimately more favorable signal. That doesn't mean the technology is malicious. It simply measures what's measurable. And what's measurable has very clear limits. Limits that exclude exactly the kind of value that leaves no digital trail. And that's where the story takes a much more interesting turn. What falls outside the radar of these systems isn't an accident. It's built into the way they work. The skills that generate the fewest measurable signals are often the ones that take the longest to develop and the hardest to replace. But because those skills don't produce clear data inside the measurement system, they gradually become invisible to the people making decisions based on that data. Without intending to, the system ends up penalizing exactly what took the longest to build. That's not neutral. It's a systemic bias that's quietly reshaping which kinds of professionals become visible to the people making decisions. And there's a second layer to this that almost never gets discussed. The same tools that measure productivity also calculate something People Analytics calls turnover risk. It's an index that estimates the likelihood that someone will leave the organization within the next few months, based on changes in their digital behavior. Less participation in internal channels, fewer interactions with teams they used to communicate with regularly, changes in response patterns or in the timing of their recorded activity. When that score rises significantly in certain predictive models, some organizations act on it. They may decide to invest in retaining that employee, or they may decide the investment isn't worth making and begin planning internally before the employee has said a single word. What that person doesn't know is that the assessment has already taken place. Decisions that affect their future may already have been influenced by data they've never seen, generated by behaviors they never imagined could matter to their career. That varies widely, depending on the company, the industry, and the laws of each country. Not every organization has systems this sophisticated, and the ones that do rely on them to very different degrees. But the direction of the trend is well documented. And over the past several years, a growing number of companies have begun incorporating this kind of analysis into the way they manage talent. There's something else about this process that deserves far more attention, and it almost never comes up in conversations about artificial intelligence at work. These systems don't just measure what you produce. They also track how your behavior changes during periods of organizational uncertainty. Someone who becomes less active on internal platforms after a restructuring, responds less often in team channels, or simply stops generating the same volume of visible interactions they once did, may end up sending exactly the kind of signal some predictive models associate with disengagement, even when that drop in visibility is a completely rational response to an environment that's suddenly changed and still doesn't make sense. The system has no context. It only has data, and the data says what it says, regardless of the story behind it. The moment you most need time to process what's happening may be the exact moment the system records your lowest level of activity. And that's where a shift in power begins, one that very few people are describing with any real precision. In the traditional corporate world, power was distributed in familiar ways. The people with privileged information, the people with direct access to senior leadership, the people who controlled resources, the people who had been around the longest and carried the deepest institutional knowledge. Those forms of power haven't disappeared, but a new layer has been added on top of them. The people who understand how the measurement system works and consciously operate within it now have an advantage that simply didn't exist before. And the people who don't understand it, or worse, don't even realize the system exists, are operating at a disadvantage they can't even see. The story your work tells now exists in two different versions. One is the version the people around you experience directly, built on real interactions, shared context, and years of accumulated knowledge. The other is the version automatically generated by the data, without anyone interpreting it, adding nuance, or preserving the context that explains what actually happened. And if those two versions look very different, the one that ends up influencing certain decisions about your future won't necessarily be the one you know to be true. What's interesting is that this isn't the first time the corporate world has quietly redistributed power like this. The people who figured out how performance evaluations really worked before everyone else did had an advantage. The people who understood how informal decision-making actually happened inside organizations before most of their colleagues caught on had an advantage too. The advantage was never about being the most capable person in a system whose rules everyone understood equally. It came from understanding the real rules before everyone else realized they'd changed. This moment is no different. It's simply happening faster, with less visibility, and it's much harder to recognize from the inside because the data driving it isn't available to the very people being measured by it. Understanding what the system records, what it ignores, and the kinds of conclusions it's likely to draw has real strategic value in today's workplace. Not because you should manufacture a false image of yourself, but because you need to make sure the work you're already doing is legible to the systems that increasingly influence how that work is recognized. Making your contributions visible in the channels where visibility matters. Documenting work that would otherwise disappear below the radar. Maintaining a measurable presence that accurately reflects the value you actually create. That's not gaming the system. It's learning to speak the language the system understands. Artificial intelligence isn't just changing the way we work, it's changing the rules of power inside organizations. And those rules aren't explained in team meetings or written into corporate culture documents. They operate quietly through systems that most people use every day without fully understanding what those systems are recording, or what that information is ultimately being used for. If the algorithm evaluating your performance had to describe your professional value today based only on the data it already has about you, would it reach the same conclusion as the people who truly know your work? As uncomfortable as that question may be, it's worth more than any performance review someone has scheduled for next quarter. If you want to keep understanding how power really works inside organizations before it affects you without warning, this is the place to do it.